After some less than stellar recent entries and a rather lengthy and somewhat problematic development cycle, Final Fantasy returns with its 15th numbered entry in an attempt to reinvigorate the franchise. While this game is helmed by a new team that has certainly made a few changes, can they really manage to live up to the hype and repair the damages of previous entries? Let's take a look at the story first. I won't go through everything, both because I don't really want to or have the time to do so, but also because I can't really do that. Partially this is due to the fact that I haven't actually completed the game yet, but it also has a bit to do with the fact that the story can get a bit confusing and forgettable. Basically, you play as a prince by the name of Noctis, as he and his three companions, Gladiolus, Ignis and Prompto, travel to a distant city in preparation of Noctis' upcoming marriage to a princess by the name of Lunafreya, who's apparently also some sort of oracle healer or something. Before Noctis and his pals reach their destination though, they receive word that their homeland has been attacked by the Empire, that the crystal has been captured, and that the king, Lunafreya and Noctis himself are believed to be dead. After travelling back and confirming that their land is indeed under siege, Noctis and his cohorts meet up with a few allies and are instructed to locate and retrieve some legendary weapons in order for Noctis to take on the Empire, retrieve the crystal and reclaim his throne. This sets in motion a long and hazardous journey full of various trials for Noctis and his friends to overcome. There is of course a bit more to it than that, but that is pretty much the basic setup. If it still seems like I'm glossing over a few important details and such though, that might be because that's exactly what the game does as well. Don't get me wrong, it's not like the story is impossible to follow or anything, especially as things progress, but there are also quite a few details that seem to be strangely absent. We don't really get to know much about this supposedly evil empire, we're seemingly supposed to feel bad when characters we hardly know die off screen, and several terminologies are never really explained. This isn't solely down to poor writing or storytelling though, as this game is actually part of yet another mini-universe within this franchise, similar to what eventually happened to Final Fantasy VII for instance. Yeah, there's both a companion film and a 5-episode anime tie-in for this game, both of which probably explain a few of the missing details, backstories and such. Now, as someone who hasn't seen either of these things, I find this really annoying. I mean, it would be one thing if these things were made if and when the game actually became a success, but creating a whole media franchise thing before the game is even released just seems wrong. I shouldn't have to buy additional content just to understand everything, so either way, this is bullshit. That said, it might not really matter much in the long run. Firstly, because you should still manage to figure things out, and secondly, because the story isn't necessarily that important anyway. You see, this is an open world game, meaning there are plenty of things to do besides the main missions. In fact, I would say there's actually way too much shit to do. Yeah, maybe this seems like a weird complaint, but seriously, there's just way too much stuff in this game. Even the very first area is filled to the brim with various side quests and treasure hunts, but I'm sorry, shouldn't the story at least get going first? I literally spent 4 or 5 hours just on the introductory segments, and I didn't even do a fraction of the available missions. Sure, most of these things are optional, and I guess it is nice to have a lot of relatively varied content, but it just feels like filler. I just don't think it should be possible, even in an open world game, to completely halt the story for several hours before the characters are even properly introduced. Honestly, it just ends up making the game feel unfocused and bloated. That's not to say the content is necessarily bad, far from it in fact. Several of both the main and optional missions are extremely enjoyable, and a big part of that has to do with the new battle system. You see, this game has taken a page out of Kingdom Hearts' book and swapped the turn-based and/or automatic systems of the past with a more action-oriented real-time system. In essence, you can equip up to 4 weapons or magic spells to the directional buttons and switch between them on the fly during battle. You can then attack with the attack button, dodge, defend and parry with the defend button, and use the so-called warp move with the warp button. Basically, warping makes you instantly warp to another section of the field. This can either be used to attack enemies from a greater distance, usually inflicting more damage, or it can be used to get out of trouble and/or reach warp points where you can regain some health and MP. That's right, you still have MP or magic points, which are used when warping or when using various team commands and techniques. You see, during battle, Noctis' pals not only assist by automatically attacking the enemies, they can also be called on to initiate various attacks or helpful stat boosts and the like. They can also help you recover if your health gets low, all of which comes in very handy. There are a few other elements to the battles as well, especially once you unlock more abilities and such, but I think you get the idea. Like I mentioned, this usually works pretty damn well, although battles can have a tendency to become a bit chaotic and hard to follow. The camera can also get partially or even fully obscured at times, making certain fights a complete visual mess. Leveling up is also handled a bit differently than usual in this game. Or you still gain EXP pretty much how you'd expect, by battling enemies or undertaking various quests and such, but weirdly, you don't actually gain these points right away. Instead, you just collect and store them until you rest at a camp or an inn of some kind. Yeah, for some reason, you have to find a place to rest if you actually want to use the experience points you collect. You won't gain a single level or stat until you do so, your EXP will just sit there. I guess this was done to give you some excuse to rest more often and to skip the night times or something, but to me this still seems pretty weird. Seriously, why not just gain EXP as you go? Well, like I said, this does give you more of a reason to return to camps a bit more often, but you'd more than likely do that anyway. After all, you're much more likely to run into enemies that will completely obliterate you if you travel during night hours, and besides, you're all but forbidden to use your car at night anyway, at least to begin with. This all means that you will be resting at inns and camps a fair amount no matter what, which, while useful in certain respects, also gets incredibly tedious and annoying. I mean, you'll basically be going back and forth between missions and campsites all the time, at least if you want to avoid impossible enemies and or actually increase your stats, which just ends up becoming such a chore. Thankfully, this game is at least very easy on the eyes. The grand scope of the landscape is very impressive and most of the creature designs are downright spectacular. There are also very few graphical glitches, and the few that do occasionally pop up are so brief and negligible that they're hardly worth mentioning. Unfortunately, the same can't really be said for the loading times. Okay, so in all fairness, I wouldn't really say that there are many loading screens, but whenever they turn up, they seem to last for quite a long time. Seriously, I don't think a single one of the loading screens lasts less than at least a few minutes, which isn't the worst, but it's definitely noticeable. I know it's because it's such a big game world and all, but it's still pretty bad. Ultimately, this game just ends up feeling like a bit of a mixed bag. Oh, it's certainly far better than the last few entries in the series, but that's not really saying much. I did find this game pretty damn engaging, and there are plenty of missions and elements that make it stand out, but unfortunately, it's also slightly confusing, overstuffed with stuff, and somewhat chaotic. If you can overlook a few annoyances and some rather puzzling choices, or you're just looking for a game filled with random things to do, this will probably suit you well. But if you're looking for a truly brilliant Final Fantasy game, you're better off looking elsewhere. Sure, this is a pretty decent attempt, but Final Fantasy XV can't quite reach the level it wants. Since we're talking about one of the most anticipated games of the year though, we might as well take a look at one of the other ones as well, namely The Last Guardian. These games may not exactly be similar, but the development histories actually are. They both began development about a decade ago, and they were both thought to be cancelled at several points. With that in mind, can The Last Guardian manage to live up to expectations, or does it come up short as well? Well, let me put it to you this way. Out of these two games, I ultimately enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy a lot more, and I can't believe I'm actually saying that. Don't get me wrong, it's not like this is truly terrible, and you can't really compare these two games as they are quite different, but if I had to choose one, I would have to go with Final Fantasy. The Last Guardian unfortunately just gets a bit too frustrating, but why don't I just try to explain what I'm talking about? First off, the story. You're a little boy who wakes up in a cave after something caused you to pass out. Your body has also been covered in mysterious symbols, and oh, there's a giant mythical beast chained up next to you. Isn't there always? This beast, that looks kinda like a mix between a bird, a cat and a dog, is known as Trico, or however you're supposed to pronounce that. Apparently, these creatures are thought of as vicious and deadly beasts that one should never go near, but you'll quickly realize that this isn't exactly an accurate description. You see, after you treat Trico's wounds, feed it and help it get free, you start to bond with the creature as you both try to navigate your way through a massive and labyrinthian mass of ruins and mountainous landscapes. There is a bit more to the story than that, but it is mostly about the two of you forming a special bond and overcoming various obstacles together. I don't really have any problems with the story though. Sure, it's simplistic and minimal, and I'm not quite sure it was such a good idea to have it be told as a flashback from the perspective of the boy after he's grown up, but there's not really anything wrong with it per se. The issues unfortunately have more to do with the actual game. As I mentioned, the meat of the game is to make it through various platforming and puzzle-based obstacles with the help of your new beast pal, Trico. Most of these puzzles are pretty straightforward and easy enough to figure out, but unfortunately, the controls are less than optimal. Or they do tend to work, but they are kind of fidgety and unreliable. For example, you can and indeed have to climb and cling onto Trico from time to time. While this usually works well enough, there are times when you'll end up crawling in the wrong directions and/or where you lose your grip without actually having done anything wrong. Yes, these are minor issues, but they do become very noticeable after a while. The climbing controls are actually really problematic throughout most of the game. Climbing up and down works okay, but the game has real difficulties figuring out the difference between you leaning away from a chain so you can jump off it and you just repositioning yourself. It does seem like the position of the camera plays a bit of a part in this as well, but yeah, it is rather troublesome. Speaking of the camera, that's another issue. Again, it's not a massive problem most of the time, but there are several moments where your view will be completely obscured by Trico's butt, or where you can't quite see where you're supposed to go, as the camera just doesn't want to position itself properly. May seem like another minor complaint, but trust me, it really adds up to a big annoyance. Then there's a slightly bigger issue, Trico himself, or herself, I don't actually know if it's male or female. Either way, it seems to have a bit of a listening problem, as giving it a command doesn't always seem to have any effect at all. This isn't really a problem right away, as you won't be able to directly command Trico from the start, but once you can, it still won't do as told all the time. This, rather obviously, causes some serious frustration and annoyances at times. I mean, when you have to get Trico to do a specific action or go to a specific spot in order to progress, and it instead stands there staring at a wall, you'd be forgiven for wanting to hurl the game into the sun. Remarkably though, I still never got angry or annoyed with Trico itself. Quite the opposite, in fact. Yeah, this is most definitely the biggest strength of this game, Trico's charm and endearing quality. I honestly don't think I've ever come across another virtual creature that I've ended up caring this much for this quickly. Trico is just so lovable, so cute, and so recognizably pet-like to anyone who's ever had a dog, cat, or the like, that it's impossible to get angry with it. Seriously, everything from the way Trico moves to the way he will curiously bat at a wheel or tug at a rope is just so lifelike and adorable. Hell, I even feel like I started to understand its various grunts and roars even more than intended, and I honestly felt bad every time I had to leave it behind to find a switch or something, especially when it then cried out in loneliness. Yes, I am a total girl. In all seriousness, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but Trico really is one of, if not the most memorable and endearing creatures of any video game ever. Then again, if it hadn't been, the game would be rather pointless or at least entirely unforgivable. Yeah, that's the thing. If it wasn't for all the feels Trico produces, I would struggle to even call the game mediocre. Sure, the puzzles are okay and the visuals and soundtrack are pretty spectacular, but the camera and controls just get way too frustrating, and Trico not understanding your commands all that well just ends up getting in the way of any actual enjoyment. Ultimately, The Last Guardian has its moments, but it's just not enjoyable enough. I really wish I could say otherwise because I really want to love it, if for no other reason than to give Trico the love it deserves. But as it is, I simply can't justify recommending this much too frustrating and far too annoying experience.